I just defeated all 25 bosses in Dark Souls 3, and now I'm gonna rank every single one of them from worst to best. So, Dark Souls 3 has a total of 25 bosses, 19 of them being from the base game and 6 of them from the DLC. It is the Souls game with the least amount of bosses in the series, with Dark Souls 1 having 26 and Dark Souls 2 having 42. The amount of bosses heavily indicates the quality of the bosses, and Dark Souls 3 took a quality over quantity approach to them. It's why I personally think Dark Souls 3 has the best bosses in the franchise. Now after saying that, not all bosses are perfect in this game. You have bosses that have great elements in almost every single way, and then you have the complete shit bosses that make you want to uninstall the game. In order to give all the bosses a genuine and fairly objective ranking, I'll be fighting them with the most basic, bare-bones archetype, which is a generic knight with a sword and shield. I'm not gonna one-shot the boss with magic, or tank 500 fucking hits from the boss. I'm just gonna play the game how it was meant to be played. Anyways, let's rank our bosses from worst to best. We're gonna start with the first boss, or rather, the worst boss in the game. I gotta say, this is definitely the worst boss in the entire game. I'll give it points for uniqueness though. It's one of the few bosses in FromSoft games where an enemy player can be a boss if played online. But I'm not going to be ranking this fight with the online battles because that would just be very inconsistent. You could get players with 500 ping that just absolutely destroy you with their full Havel set and their Pontiff Knight curved sword, or you could get Steven_Garcia09 who doesn't even know what fucking planet he's on. The outcome can form in a ton of different ways, and sometimes the PvP fights can honestly be fun and exciting, but it's just way too inconsistent to fairly rank. On the other hand, the offline version of this boss is absolutely horrible. First of all, every time you enter the arena, you have to listen to this boring ass dialogue that is unskippable, and then you have to wait for the boss to summon, but it doesn't even summon? A Painting Guardian NPC spawns, and you have to wait a little while for the actual boss to spawn. You want to kill the Painting Guardian quickly though, because it can turn into a 2-on-1. And I also have to mention that the Painting Guardian can heal halflight if you're not quick enough. So you kill the Guardian and you're good, right? Nope. Another Painting Guardian can spawn during the middle of the fight and will most likely heal the boss. But now it's time to talk about halflight. He has and will use everything in his arsenal to annoy the hell out of you. He has one of the best weapons in the game with a ranged attack. He has a bow, he has multiple spells that track you. You starting to notice a pattern here? He spams so much random shit at you, and oh, I guess he can parry too. I personally think this guy absolutely deserves to be in this spot. In the world of Dark Souls, there are ancient dragons, royal knights in shining armor, mages, and giants, but the old Demon King is kinda just existing. Probably one of the most, if not the most generic and forgettable fights in the game, ODK sits in his little hellhole, kind of just waiting for you to walk towards him. In terms of design, he looks like one of those demons you see as mini-bosses, which isn't really a redeeming quality. And as for the boss fight itself, it isn't that special. In fact, it's extremely annoying. All of his attacks revolve around him using fire or just slamming his hammer. The boss has an abundance of AoE attacks, including this pathetic meteor shower that forces you to run away and hold off on attacking for a bit. I feel the need to mention that this guy probably has the most annoying attack in the game. The attack where he brings out a fireball and explodes it in your face is so damn annoying. He somehow always uses it when you're in the middle of an attack animation, and it has a lingering hitbox to roll catch you if you roll too early. To be honest, pretty much all of his attacks are annoying to fight against. Yeah, this boss kinda sucks and is easily forgettable. The wyvern is a gimmick boss, a very weak one too. You don't even really fight it. It's basically a small level with the wyvern acting as a stage hazard. Now, you can technically fight it, but it's designed to have an absurd amount of health, so it's not advised. Now about the level. It's a small linear pathway with some of the most annoying enemies in the game blocking your way. They come out from corners, they throw tons of projectile attacks at you, and there are just way too many of them. So you're given two choices, run or fight. Fighting all of the enemies isn't the best idea since they all gank you while the wyvern shoots flames at you too. Running is the best option since there's little to no trouble and it's pretty easy. Once you finish the level, the game gives you an obvious indication to plunge attack the dragon, and just like that, the dragon is... gets one hit KO'd. I mean, yeah, that's it. At least the animation looks cool for like 2 seconds. The reason I'm ranking this boss so low is because it's so anticlimactic and just boring. Whenever I go through this area to fight the Nameless King, I never look forward to fighting this boss. Aldrich, one of the Lords of Cinder, is a boss you get to fight in goddamn Orlando, a classic location from Dark Souls 1. He's even a mutated form of one of the bosses in DS1, fighting in the same arena as Ornstein and Smo, a legendary boss from that game. But guess what? The boss kinda sucks. He's just yet another boss who throws every projectile they have at you. He's got an arrow attack that can one-shot you if you get too careless, a bunch of tiny projectiles, a soul spear. Like, how is this fun to fight against? Oh, and if you catch up to him and dodge his projectiles, he has an AoE attack that punishes you for getting too close to him, and then he teleports to the other side of the arena, repeating the same process that you just had to deal with. His backstory is pretty cool though, and as you can tell by the name, he's a god devourer, explaining his attacks that he steals from other bosses, like the arrow attack and the lifesteal scythe. Other than that, I dislike this boss. The Crystal Sage is a boss that I think has so much potential, but as you can see, it ended up pretty low on the list. The design itself is fairly interesting, and you could imagine the Sage having these crazy magic attacks like a Soul Greatsword or a Soul Axe or something. But instead all it does is spam projectiles at you. Even worse, when the Sage clones itself, all the other clones start spamming projectiles too. The closest thing to a melee attack this boss has is its weak rapier attack. The reason this boss is better than the last few is because it's insanely easy and doesn't really stand in your way. Wolnir is one of those bosses that looks insanely menacing but poses no actual threat to the player. You enter his arena that is covered in darkness and you're directed towards this shining item only to be fucking jump scared by this towering skeleton with all sorts of jewelry. But once you start fighting this boss, you slowly realize how stupid easy it is. All you have to do is break his 3 golden bracelets and then he just falls into the abyss. The bracelets have a tiny amount of health and he leaves so much time for you to attack them. Now, he can spawn skeletons, and he also has this devastating smoke attack, but by the time he gets a chance to use those attacks, he's already dead. Wolnir has an interesting design and a good atmosphere to his arena, but doesn't live up to his name gameplay-wise. There definitely is some wasted potential that applies to this boss. Alright, let's look at this. So, when you enter the arena, you get 3 wolves who rush at you at the same time. Soon after, the gravetender comes out, so you'll have to make sure you kill those wolves fast enough or you'll get ganked. Once the gravetender loses about half of his health, he summons his dog, which can also gank you if you don't kill the gravetender fast enough. This fight kind of sucks while you're getting ganked, but it isn't so bad fighting the enemies one-on-one. It's actually quite enjoyable when it's fair. The gravetender's dog is very similar to Vordt with his charging attacks and frost attacks. But unfortunately, this boss gets weighed down by the fact that it's an NPC boss fight and you can get 2v1'd. Again, it isn't all that bad though. But there really isn't much else to talk about this boss fight anymore. I mean, at least the soundtrack kinda slaps. The Curse-Rotted Greatwood is certainly a unique and memorable boss. The arena is absolutely massive and you are left wondering when the boss is going to appear, then suddenly a big ass tree pops out of the background and poison fucking ball sacks appear on it? Like, who thinks of this? Seriously. Once you break the first, sack, the arena crumbles and you fall like 150 feet into a pit. A pale arm bursts out of the tree and starts grabbing you and vomiting shit everywhere. Like, this is definitely one of the wackiest and most insane bosses in the entire franchise, but unfortunately it falls a little short in the gameplay areas. To start, there are various random hollows that can all attack you while the Greatwood is still in its first phase, which is completely unnecessary, and some of its attacks are poorly telegraphed. Speaking of its attacks, all it does is kind of move its body around and occasionally spurt out a pool of something, so while the Greatwood is a special boss in its own way, it might not be that fun to play against. I know some people dislike the deacons because of their stupidly easy difficulty, and to be honest, they're kind of right. But they actually bring some good mechanics into the fight. The deacons can punish you for being too passive as they build up curse if you don't pursue them, and they can be distracted with alluring skulls. And it's actually very satisfying to chop to the deacons because they have such low health and there's so many of them. While they might not be intimidating, they aren't such a pain to fight against. It's decent. Oceiros is probably the most vocal boss in the series, with him spouting out threats and madness to the player as you fight him. But this boss has some surprisingly good lore. Oceiros was once a king of Lothric but fell to madness in the Grand Archives. His child Ocelot is presumably invisible or simply just doesn't exist, and the player is left assuming that Oceiros is just crazy. But in Phase 2, Ocelot begins to cry and suddenly the player is left wondering if the child really exists. Did Oceiros go mad in the Grand Archives, or did he mutate his child and gain the power of the dragons, creating a dragon child? I have no clue, but enough lore I don't give a shit about. What about the actual boss? Well, it starts off pretty easy, with telegraph attacks that do little damage, but in Phase 2, he turns into a crazy, unhinged beast and starts throwing these temper tantrum attacks at you with little room for you to take breaks. He also has this one charging attack with zero telegraphing whatsoever. This motherfucker escaped from Bloodborne and got put into the wrong game, but at least he actually puts up a fight, which I respect. Some attacks are questionable, but this boss gets the job done. Yhorm, another Lord of Cinder, is an interesting gimmick fight. Kind of like the King of the Storm from Demon Souls, the player is given a unique weapon to kill the boss. The weapon is coincidentally the Storm Ruler. While it might just seem like a typical greatsword, using its weapon art reveals its true power. A devastating leaf blower is hiding behind this greatsword and it is fun as hell to use. Just the use of the Storm Ruler in this fight is enough for me to like it. It only takes like 6 Storm Ruler hits to take down Yhorm, but those 6 hits are at least satisfying. Yhorm is one of the few gimmick fights from FromSoft that I actually enjoy. The music, combined with the animation and the attacks, makes this boss fight pretty special, but it was kind of disappointing to see this boss be a gimmick fight as he was hyped in the cutscenes being a Lord of Cinder and all. Okay, you know how I was talking shit for like the past 10 bosses? Well, there isn't going to be much to talk shit about now, cause we are getting farther down the list. These bosses don't have many flaws, and will be praised a lot more. Starting off with Vordt, he serves as the second boss in the game. It starts off with an iconic cutscene and is the final challenge found in the first level. Vordt has a great balance of difficulty and has a good way of introducing Dark Souls 3's brand new frostbite mechanic. This is such a fun and short fight, and it wants the player to apply all these lessons learned from their journey so far. But once Vordt goes into Phase 2, this is where it grabs my attention. He begins to charge at the player multiple times and uses his Frost Breath move, leaving an opportunity for the player to attack. It would also be a crime for me to not mention this boss's iconic soundtrack. This catchy score is very popular and it originated from this boss. Without Vordt, Dark Souls 3 would not be as memorable as it is today. This is a reputable early game boss and teaches the player how to survive in the world of Dark Souls. Funnily enough, the Dancer is actually right across the street from Vordt. Not only that, but both the Dancer and Vordt are extremely iconic. They both have recognizable cutscenes and designs while also coming from the same land. The Dancer is a boss you teleport to after defeating the third Lord of Cinder and is an obstacle guarding your access to one of the final areas of the game and the last Lord of Cinder. It is an admirable boss that moves with grace and deadliness. It starts off with that creepy and cool ass cutscene where it drips and crawls down the stained glass window. You'd think that a boss that moves pretty slowly and unpredictably would be a hassle to telegraph and dodge, but no, the Dancer manages to make it fun and challenging for the player to play against. When the Dancer goes into its second phase, it unleashes a violent spin attack which can be very scary if you're too close. This is an unforgettable boss when it comes to gameplay and design, making it a really fun fight in my opinion. You remember a couple minutes ago I was praising Vordt for being a great early game boss? Well, forget everything I said because iudex Gundyr gets my vote for the best early game boss. I mean, he's literally the tutorial boss and basically the first real enemy you fight in the game. Right off the bat, you'll realize that Gundyr is the most formidable tutorial boss in the Souls series. Dark Souls 1's Asylum Demon was lacking in the difficulty department, and Dark Souls 2's, oh yeah, that game doesn't have a tutorial boss. That game doesn't have a lot of things actually. Anyways, Gundyr is a mean hunk of metal and a physical barrier for the player, testing if they are really worthy of playing Dark Souls 3. Of course, over my plenty of playthroughs, Gundyr serves little challenge now, but I won't lie, in my first playthrough I died a couple of times to this mammoth knight. He essentially tells the player, if you can't beat me, you can't beat this game. He can pummel you with his halberd and can even punch the player for choosing a bad time to drink Estus. Gundyr can also be parried, rewarding players brave and skilled enough to challenge Gundyr's might. Where it gets really exciting though is in his second phase. A phase change, which I'm sure startled many players including myself, comes out at a devastating surprise. Gundyr transforms, gaining new attacks and a new terrifying look. While this form may be frightening, FromSoft doesn't go too hard on the player by making the attacks easy to dodge. Maybe I have a soft spot for Gundyr, but I will never forget starting my journey with him. The Abyss Watchers are a sensational first lord of Cinder. Every time I fight these guys I just get so excited because I know I'm gonna have a lot of fun. They have one of the best intro cutscenes in the game, and some of the most outstanding fight mechanics this series has ever seen. When the fight begins, a single Abyss Watcher runs towards you after challenging you, and the fight goes on. After a while of battling, a second Abyss Watcher rises from the dead and charges at you from out of nowhere. Thoughts go through your mind, and you start to think that this fight may be an unfair gank battle, when from all of a sudden a rogue Abyss Watcher starts defending you and evens out the gank. When I first saw this, I was mind blown, and it hyped me up for the fight even more. After that sequence of fighting, a new Abyss Watcher rises, this time becoming embered with the power of all the fallen Watchers. It gains an entire new moveset, and a great one at that. The Abyss Watchers have such cool concepts and execute them almost perfectly. My only tiny gripe with this boss is that it is a little bit too easy to abuse. Backstabs, parrying, and stun locking can be taken advantage of, and it makes the fight a bit anticlimactic. Other than that, this boss is amazing. Alright, we have officially reached the top 10 list. Get ready to see some absolute banger bosses. I just want to remind you that I think all these bosses are amazing, and let me just explain to you a little bit more about that. Say I rank the number 6 boss, and then the number 5 boss. These two bosses are both so insanely good that the difference between them is extremely minute. So what I'm trying to say here is that pretty much all of these bosses are ranked in such a close vicinity that you can basically argue who is better than who. With that out of the way, our number 10 spot goes to the Dragonslayer armor. I just have to take a moment and say that the scenery and presentation of this boss fight is enough to make it on the top 10 list. You enter the fog wall nearing the peak of Lothric, where this massive tank is obstructing your path. The dark sign is starting to rise, and chaos butterflies roam near the bridge. Like, this arena is definitely one of the best out there. But something about this boss looks familiar. If you played Dark Souls 1, you'll notice that the armor is a callback to Ornstein from Dark Souls 1. This time though, there is a creative change applied to him. Instead of the quick and dexterous boss he was from DS1, he is now a hulking set of armor, controlled by the chaos butterflies. Instead of hitting you with swift attacks, he now hits you with destructive wind-up attacks, which is a nice little twist. All this combined with the amazing score and special attacks from the butterflies make this boss fight a shocking cinematic experience for an endgame boss. The Nameless King is a boss commonly praised for being the hardest in the game, and while I don't necessarily agree with that claim, he can still mess me up if I'm not careful enough. It's a two-phase boss fight, with the first phase facing you against the Storm Drake that he mounts. The first phase is honestly the weakest part about this fight. The Nameless King itself would be a top 3 boss if it didn't get weighed down by this slightly annoying dragon phase. The only reasonable time you get to attack the dragon is when it bends down and uses its fire-breathing attack. It also has a downward fire spread attack that requires you to time your dash pretty much perfectly to avoid it. But this first phase certainly isn't bad. It looks cool, it nails the visuals, and the Nameless King even throws in some of its own attacks to warm up the player for phase 2. Speaking of phase 2, this is where the fight really gets to shine. The cutscene references another cutscene from the Ornstein and Smo boss fight where one of the partners absorbs the remaining power of their fallen friend. The Nameless King then challenges you to an amazing 1v1 fight. This is certainly an endurance challenge as well, because if you die in the second phase, you have to start phase 1 all over again. The actual Nameless King isn't meant to be taken lightly too. He has a sizable chunk of health and a set of some of the coolest attacks in the game, while also wielding one of the coolest weapons in the game as well. This fight is most definitely hard, but it is perfectly fair in my opinion and has the perfect amount of challenge. Hey, isn't this the same guy I already fought at the beginning of the game? Well, I guess he'll be a free fight because he really wasn't that hard. I mean... Oh. Okay. Alright. Champion Gundyr takes the player by surprise, located in some alternate version of the Cemetery of Ash. It's either in the future or in the past, as it is not confirmed in the lore, but it keeps the player on the edge of their seat. You don't wait for him to approach you, he waits for you this time. The champ's first phase is just a more aggressive version of his inferior self, but once he reaches his second phase, there's a reason why they call him the champ. First of all, his eyes turn bright red, and he does this absolutely terrifying full sprint charge at you and gains a bunch of new moves. Not to mention, this is probably the most aggressive boss in the game, giving you just a minuscule amount of time to counterattack or heal, testing your patience and skill. The champ is the most enjoyable and challenging fight on this list so far, and it shows. It fully utilizes and tests Dark Souls 3's more fast-paced combat system against you, and it sure is pretty hard. I think Darkeater Midir is the one time where FromSoft actually managed to make a genuinely great dragon fight, and god damn the soundtrack blasts out so quickly and then Midir starts going crazy mode. Talk about getting the player hyped because Midir does it right. When I said Nameless King wasn't the hardest boss in the game, this is what I was talking about. Midir is the ultimate challenge in Dark Souls 3 and in my opinion will be the most challenging boss in the game for you. He honestly kind of reminds me of an Elden Ring boss in many ways. His fluid animations and insanely powerful attacks that can one-shot you, combined with an epic arena and display, he could totally pass as an Elden Ring boss. Like, look at this one laser attack for example. You see how much damage that did? And my character had an abundance of stat points leveled into Vigor. Midir will absolutely test your limits. He manages to do it in a fun and fair way too. The main mechanic of Midir is that you basically want to attack him in the head, as attacks to other parts of his body will do significantly less damage. So Midir is a boss with this much health, you have to hit him in one specific weak point and he can at least two-shot you. Seems like a recipe for disaster, right? But still, the game manages to make Midir extremely fun, which is not an easy task. This boss creates an amazing challenge and follows through with it by making the actual fight not bullshit. The only tiny problem I have with this fight is that it's a little too long to keep me 100% engaged, but that flaw doesn't mean much in the bigger picture of this boss. Pontiff is the first real challenge you get in the game and can stump overconfident players who have reached the mid-game. The bosses that you defeat before Pontiff all lack difficulty or interest, except the Abyss Watchers, just forget they exist right now. Pontiff breaks this trend of boring bosses and is a demanding boss that you meet halfway through the game. The reason I love Pontiff so much is because he's just such an elegant and stylish boss. He's just the perfect villain. You enter his badass church and at first he just stares you down with no emotion, but once you get closer he does a Gwyn-like leaping attack that surprised me the first time I fought him. Pontiff has a series of damaging combos that punish players who have been panic rolling the entire game. He's sort of similar to iudex gundyr in how he does a DPS test to the player, basically saying, if you can beat me, you're strong enough to progress. All of his combos are super satisfying to watch and dodge. Once you beat him down to around half health, then his fight seriously turns from great to amazing. Pontiff blasts you away with this AoE attack and fucking summons a phantom of himself from the Shadow Realm and you have to fight both Pontiffs at once. I also have to bring up that you can actually parry Pontiff, making the fight a lot easier. Even so, it still manages to be crazy fun parrying Pontiff, but in the second phase, Pontiff gives you less chances to parry him, making him hard to take advantage of. When Pontiff summons his phantom, he basically becomes another boss. He is much more aggressive, and now you have to deal with double the attacks heading your way. It's just such a cool fight, and when his music kicks in, the game instantly clicks. It's just amazing. The Demon Prince fight is just one of those fights that only focuses on gameplay. Not much deep lore, not any flashy cutscenes, you just simply fight the last demon who survived into the Ring City. Similar to Midir's entrance, you dive down this giant ass pit, but if you look closely, you'll see two demons. You'll be like, is this a 2v1 gank boss? But once you actually start fighting them, you realize that this is probably the best 2v1 fight FromSoft has ever designed. Remember Elden Ring? That 2v1 fight fucking sucked and pretty much everyone hated it. Remember Dark Souls 1? It was too boring and relied heavily on patience. Dark Souls 2? Dark Souls 2 is certainly a video game. My point is, almost all FromSoft's 2v1 fights have some annoying hindrances to them that make them slightly unenjoyable in some way. But this boss fight perfected the 2v1 formula. No unnecessary stupid shit, no waiting for 5 minutes to find an opening and only land one attack, they just somehow managed to create the perfect duo fight. Both demons have this incredible synergy that makes them behave in a way that is never unfair or annoying to the player. Instead of having both of them chase you, one of them goes in a passive mode, only throwing out fairly easy ranged attacks to dodge. Meanwhile, the other demon goes 100% and gets up right in your face. They constantly give you pressure, but they don't break the fundamentals of DS3's combat. This constant sense of back and forth really makes this first phase special. After you defeat both of them, depending on what demon you killed last, a different second phase will occur. The Demon Prince gains a new combative moveset and can gain either the laser moveset or the midir moveset. I personally think the laser moveset is more fun to fight against due to its simplicity though. And hey, once you beat it, you get to visit Firelink Shrine from Dark Souls 1. Oh, this is gonna be a big one. The Sister Friede fight is pretty much the only good thing to come out of the Ashes of Ariandel DLC, and it comes at the end of it. Remember Sister Friede who was guiding you through the whole DLC? Well, she's gonna beat you to a pulp now. Wait, what are those? For free? Hold on guys, I'll be back. Okay, I'm back. After the cutscene, which is amazing by the way, Friede challenges you to a duel. She might not look like much, but she can mess you up. She is exceptionally fast, and sometimes she even feels like a Bloodborne boss, but if your dodges are on point, it should be doable. Friede has a good amount of cool looking attacks, and she can go invisible too. She introduces a mechanic similar to Priscilla's, where you have to rely on sound to pinpoint her location. The first phase is not that hype, but the second phase turns up the heat. Now both Friede and Ariandel stand in your way. Will Friede destroy me while Ariandel spams range attacks at me? Or will both of them become super aggressive and start killing me? What if they each... Oh, it's already over. Well, that was easy. I wonder why this boss is considered to be so good. Is it maybe because... Okay, well, that explains that. I'm pretty sure this is the best surprise to ever happen in all of FromSoft games besides that one ape jump scare in Sekiro. I think every person who fought this boss without spoilers got a fucking heart attack when phase 3 happened. She legit rises from the dead and comes back stronger than ever before. New moves, new soundtrack, new everything. And the new moves too. Did I ever say new moves? Because goddamn, these are literally the coolest moves in the game. Leaping up and doing these flashy ass explosion attacks and grab attacks. This is the first time where it's actually fun to be grabbed by a boss. This boss is just insane on almost every level. The first two phases are kind of underwhelming, but the third phase makes up for it. It's a tough endurance test and it is really fun. This might be a surprise, but the Twin Princes are a flawless boss in my opinion. Well, so are all the other top 3 bosses, but you get the point. This could not be a better final Lord of Cinder. The music, the combat, and the presentation is at its peak here. You've reached the end of Lothric. You're ready to acquire the last Lord of Cinder's ashes. A world of fire is coming to an end and you are tasked with its destiny. The Twin Princes sit atop their bedchamber waiting for another contender who has been destined to link the flame.
Another dogged contender.
But instead of wanting to link the flame, these two accursed brothers seek to let it fade away, breaking the Age of Fire. The first one to challenge you is Lorien, the Elder Prince, and right away he introduces a new teleporting attack into the fight. I found that most people dislike this, but I think it adds an interesting new challenge to the formula. The first phase is pretty much putting the player up against Lorien to get them used to his attacks and fighting style. And the music, man, it really makes you sympathize about the tragedy of these two frail brothers cursed with their journey of linking the flame. It makes you feel like an end to an age is beginning. As the second phase cutscene starts, we see Lothric, the younger prince, join in on the battle. The two gain a new set of projectile attacks that are actually fun to play against for once. The teleporting and mix-ups become far more common and the soundtrack changes to this bombastic and dreadful choir that perfectly depicts the fight. The DS3 late game bosses are something else, man, I swear. After defeating these two guys, I actually feel bad and can feel remorse towards them. Not many bosses make me do that. The Twin Princes will always have a special place in my mind and are a perfect end to the Lords of Cinder. This is it. This is the Soul of Cinder, the final boss for the base game of Dark Souls 3. The description on the soul item he drops literally states that he's an amalgamation of every single lord who has linked the fire in the past. So in a sense, you are literally fighting your character from Dark Souls 1, and everyone else's. Isn't that insane? That little guy in Dark Souls 1 I made is one of the many different forms the final boss of Dark Souls 3 has. That right there itself is crazy enough for the Soul of Cinder to be on the number 2 spot. This man is literally on the cover art and on the promotional material for this game. Like, could he be more iconic? You return to the kiln of the first flame from Dark Souls 1, and as you walk up the pathway, you see the Dark Sign and the Soul of Cinder who is casually chilling at the bonfire, further hinting that this boss is literally the player. He proceeds to fucking pick up the sword from the bonfire and charges at you at a full sprint as the music starts. Carrying on with the theme of this boss basically being you, he has like 4 different movesets in the first phase. His sword moveset, his curved sword moveset, his mage moveset, and his spear moveset. His sword moveset, being his basic and main moveset, is the first fighting style you'll see. His other movesets will change as the fight goes on. His curved sword moveset is basically a dex pyromancer build, his mage moveset is pure intelligence, and his spear is a miracle build. All of them are super fun to fight against and ramp up the intensity. For some of his fighting styles, some amazing special moves are used. His pyromancer build can backflip just like in Dark Souls 1, and his mage build has the soul stream, or basically that one move from Dragon Ball Z. But if you thought it ended there, then you are very, very wrong. Once you beat his first phase, his entire health bar resets, and fucking Gwyn's theme from Dark Souls 1 just comes out of nowhere. And to top it off, he even gains the exact same moveset that Gwyn has. This is the Soul of Cinder's final effort to defeat you, and he brings out the Lord who linked the first flame and started it all. This amazing second phase completely changes the mood and feel for the fight, and sometimes gets me emotional. The fan service in this game is ridiculous, man. Well, that's all I have to say about him. The final boss does not disappoint. Yep, of course. Everyone knew it was going to be Gael. Who else could it be? Joking aside, I don't even know where to start. This is literally the perfect boss. I guess we'll start with some context. By this point, the player has gone through the entirety of the Ring City and has just beaten Halflight. Remember Halflight? Kinda funny how the best boss and the worst boss are placed right beside each other. Anyways, the player then travels to the literal end of the world. Diligent fans will spot some similarities to this area, and the reason why is because it's the location seen in the cover of the game. You can even see Lothric and Anor Londo, which is pretty neat. And can I just say that we are at World's End here? It's so bleak and so cinematic, which is such a fitting end to the series. So what are we even doing in this area though? As the player traverses forward, we come across Gael, a slave knight whose task is to find the blood of the Dark Soul for his lady's painting. Gael has 3 phases, with each of them increasing in intensity as the fight goes on, and every single phase is excellent. The first phase is certainly the simplest, but it's just a sample for what Gael has to offer next. He doesn't have any special attacks, but rather just a feral moveset with uncoordinated combos and swings. Don't get me wrong, this phase is still great, but the juicy parts are in the next phases. The cutscene that plays during phase 2 will forever be praised by Dark Souls fans. Gael turns hollow and realizes that he had the blood of the Dark Soul all along, making him exclaim,
Is this the blood? The blood of the Dark Soul.
He said it. Oh my god, he said it. He said the word. Just roll the credits. Go to the credits. As I said before, Gael realizes after all this time, searching until the end of the world, he was the key all along. Completing his mission and losing his purpose, he turns hollow. Phase 2 is where the fight gains its admiration from. His moveset changes and he sports a menacing cape. The phase change also switches up the music and it gives me goosebumps every time. All these components just merge together seamlessly and create what I think is the best boss in gaming. Literally every move Gael attacks you with is perfect. He also establishes this cape mechanic in battle, where Gael performs a directional cape hit depending on which way his sword swung, creating an interesting challenge for rolling his attacks. You have to roll the opposite way Gael swung in order to not get hit by his cape, which is very unique and satisfying to perform. After this phase, Gael brings out his final effort and bursts out an AoE attack with skulls that represent the amount of lives he has taken during the search of his Dark Soul. He pulls out a Glock too. I'm not kidding. He pulls out a Glock and it's terrifying. Gael attacks you with the most creative and cinematic attacks the series has, with him leaping and thrusting his sword gracefully, and doing these 360 cape sword attacks, and the most ridiculous one by far. He leaps up, shoots his Glock, and slams back down. I don't have any other words to describe how breathtaking this boss is, so I'll just show it to you. See what I mean? No other game could do this. Not Elden Ring, not Dark Souls 1, not fucking Bad Rats. This boss right here is why I think the Souls series, especially Dark Souls 3, is just the peak of video games. Gael just encapsulates the entire purpose of Dark Souls. He was an absolute nobody, being a slave knight used as fodder, dying over and over again. He then found purpose from the painter, and became stronger and stronger after each death, pushing towards the goal. It's only at the end of time where we are the only ones left. Us and Gael have outlived gods, dragons, and royalty. It's just two nobodies fighting at the end of time, indicating that only the most resilient of men survive in the end. It's the perfect love letter to the end of the Dark Souls franchise, and it couldn't have been done better. Well, holy shit, that was a long video. It was pretty fun to make though. These are just my opinions, so if you think I'm wrong and believe that the tree ball sect thing is the best boss in the game, that's fine by me. Anyways, I don't really have anything else to say. If you made it this far, thanks for watching my video. Bye bye!